So, David, last time we heard the author launching into this little homily about Christ's death and
Yes,
exaltation
yeah.
as equivalent to or somehow related to the action of a high priest on
Yeah.
Yom Kippur. And we saw him relating it to the Jeremiah quotation, the promise of a new covenant, right?
Absolutely.
So he continues with the image of Christ entering heaven with his blood and at the end of chapter 9. And then talks about the once-for-all sacrifice of Christ in chapter 10. What exactly is going on with all of this?
A huge set of questions, and let me just give a few indications of what I think is happening, and then ask you to kind of elaborate and help us think it through. Very important is the sense that we've seen so many times that while the old was good, something new and better has come. That the sacrifice of the high priest, the sacrifices of the animals, had their own place and their own time and their own validity, but now in the coming of Christ we have moved to a better covenant, a better kind of worship, and finally a better kind of behavior. So that instead of the blood of beasts and animals and so forth, what we now have is the blood of Christ, which I read not so much in the terms of this book, which is so full of stress on his obedience and faithfulness, not so much as talking about expiation or an offering to placate God, but that Christ has brought his whole life as an offering into the presence of God, and therefore, one, atones for us, brings us into the presence of God, but also, as we've seen several times, becomes a kind of example of perseverance and faithfulness for those who come afterward. And I think there's a sense that we have now entered into this world of the new covenant. We're there because there's been a new priest who has brought us there, and because we are in that new world, we follow his example in bringing our lives to God as well.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. We've seen our homilist teasing us before, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And is there a little bit of a tease going on with this image? He kind of insists on Christ bringing his blood into the heavenly Holy of Holies, right, at the end of chapter 9.
Yeah.
Insists on the once-for-all character of it, and hence the ideal oneness here.
Yeah.
But what kind of image is this? How does blood get into heaven?
How does blood get into heaven, Harry?
Well, I don't think it does, you see.
Yeah.
And I think you're right on this notion that what he's talking about as blood is really the life of Christ.
He brings himself into
brings
heaven.
himself into heaven.
Bringing himself into heaven.
And what is the self that he brings? What's going on in chapter 10 when we hear the voice of Jesus again?
Well, the self that he is he talks about bringing his whole body, his whole personhood, I think, into the presence of God, and that he comes to God as one who is perfectly obedient, perfectly faithful, and perfectly steadfast, and therefore becomes a kind of example for the Hebrews who have to, the Hebrew audience who has to hear this as well.
And when does he do that?
He does that, I take it, through his exaltation.
But what about...
You find another word for me.
In chapter 10, verse 5, it says, when Christ came into the world.
Oh, I see, with the incarnation. Man, the consummation is with the exaltation, but the actual reparation, the actual reconciliation begins with the incarnation.
Right, and I guess I'm wondering then about the relationship between what chapter 10 is saying, which gives us a portrait of Christ being totally faithful to God. Using the words of a psalm. This is the second time we've heard Jesus speak using the words of a psalm.
Right.
And this is where the reality is that casts a shadow back onto the law.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. So the light is now in this present reality. The law has now become the shadow. So we've got kind of the whole thing in reverse.
Right. And all the imagery he's been using up till now has had a kind of Platonic flavor to it, where reality was in heaven.
Yeah. So now we flip it and say, the way we live our earthly lives, the way we are incarnate bodies,
I think that's,
becomes a way of reflecting back and illumining the heavenly promise.
That's right. That's the way I take it.
Yeah,
and
that's very helpful.
You see, I think at the end of chapter 9, he's completed this setup, which operates in these Platonic, Philonic categories of a heaven and earth dichotomy, and you expect the reality to be in heaven,
but
where things are one and unified and all of that good stuff. But as I say, as you just said, he flips it in chapter 10, verses 1 through 10, and puts it on earth. It's the incarnate Christ who is presenting himself to God with the whole of his life in the words of this psalm. And the way I like to think of this psalm is this is Jesus' response to his call to be a priest, issued back in chapter 5.
Here's my body.
Psalm 10, verse
on earth,
right,
incarnate.
Right.
Well, and the nice thing then is in the last part of chapter 10, he kind of incarnates what sacrifice looks like for the believers. That you attend to one another, you visit the prisoners, you care for the sick, that their concrete lives become in a way deeds of love, which mirror the great sacrifice that he makes, both by his life and by his death and exaltation. One other theme that I note in here that we've had a little bit all along, but at the end of chapter 9, talks about waiting for Christ. At the end of chapter 10, he talks about yet a little while and I will come again. So that we do have in Hebrews what I think is really quite typical for the first century Christian person, that there are ways in which the gifts of God's mercy are present among us in the life of the church and in the way we deal with each other. It's not just a way that it's clear that Christ is now enthroned at the right hand of God, which means that in some remarkable ways the time of glory, the time of the new covenant has come. But there's something more yet to come, the final defeat of death for Paul, the final defeat of sin here, the fullness of his coming, which is more than hinted at, but is not yet complete, even in this epistle, which is very much about what we can now celebrate and sacrifice.
Yeah, there definitely is an eschatological hope, and that's going to loom pretty large in these latter chapters. We hear Jeremiah again in chapter 10, verse 16, in sort of this summary paragraph that brings the homily on the Day of Atonement to a conclusion. Why is that being?
Don't you think it seems to me the stress here is now not so much on the covenant written on the heart, is on the latter part of the claim that God actually has amnesia, pronounces amnesty, that sins are forgotten, that we move on. And this is, I think, a way of encouraging them in the new life which they now lead, and leads into his concern at the very end of chapter 10 that they not fall back, slip away, or fall into the hands of the living God. Which brings me back to my question to you. Is chapter 10 any more than in our earlier chapters an indication of a genuine crisis that he can name, or do we have kind of limiting cases? Don't be apostate, don't fall into God's angry hands. It's not that I can tell you that Maud and Charlie have been doing this. I just want to warn you not to get into that mode.
I think it's the latter. It's certainly not as strongly worded a warning as the warning was in chapter 6.
Right.
But they're words of warning.
Yeah, they're words of warning,
and our author wants to take those seriously. And people might fall out of this covenant relationship. But he certainly hopes for more than that. And does so on the basis of the experience of the congregation.
Very good.
That he cites in verse 32 and following.
Well, and the final word is comfort. This is who we're not. We're not the shrinkers, backers. We are those who are keeping the faith. Not you have lost the faith, but I know who you guys are. You're those who keep the faith, which is good news, comfort.
And he's going to issue some more comforting words in the chapters to come.
Yeah,
that's right.
This
Little parenthetic section ends on a word of hope.
And talks about faith.
In fact, what we have in all of this paranesis is the triad of faith, hope, and love. Interestingly enough, it's not highlighted in the way.
No, but it's all there.
It's all there. It's all there.
In interesting ways, I think throughout the epistles of the New Testament, there's Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and there's faith, hope, and love, and they never stop and say very often, okay, here are the three persons of God, or except for 1 Corinthians 13, here are the three great virtues, the three great acts of Christian faithfulness. But they're there. It's an underlying structure for a great deal of Christian proclamation.
It's interesting that in what follows, we're going to be concentrating a lot on faith.
A lot on faith.
And a little bit on hope.
Yeah.
Where's the love?
Stay tuned.